Ah, so you think you know what it means to be a medieval assassin? Let's get one thing straight from the start. This isn't the dramatic, moonlit ballet Hollywood promised you. There's no slow-motion leap from a rooftop, no crisp black hood fluttering in the wind, and certainly no swelling orchestral theme whenever you sidle into a shadow. Instead, welcome to the part of history where the only thing swelling is the infection in your leg from last month's botched escape. Before we slip further down this grimy alley, do me a favor if you actually appreciate this kind of myth-slaughtering storytelling. Hit subscribe. Don't bother if you're just here for another montage. And because I'm nosy, drop a comment with your city and your time zone. I want to know where all these would-be assassins are lurking around the globe. Now dim your lights, let the whir of your fans set the mood, and brace yourself. We're not just peeling back the legend, we're scraping it off with a rusty spoon. Here's what nobody tells you. Nobody in medieval Europe ever grew up thinking, I'd love to get paid 12 coins to jab a baron in the spleen, then marinate in a barrel for 3 days. Becoming an assassin wasn't a calling. It was the last stop on the Misery Express, and you missed every better station. The folks who took up this line of work weren't shadowy monks from mountaintop fortresses. They were the dregs, failed soldiers, homeless wanderers, ex-thieves with nothing left to lose, or those so invisible to society, even the tax collector gave up trying to find them. If you owned land, livestock, or could spell your own name, you were management material. If you couldn't, congratulations, you were about to be the reason everyone else double-checked their window latches at night. Let's be honest, nobody ever hired you to dispatch Mildred the shepherd or Clive the quiet turnip grower. Your contracts were always the kind that came with a moat, 6 guards, and a strong possibility of being boiled alive. By the time you found yourself staring down the business end of a coin purse and a whispered name, you'd already gambled away your future, your family, and any hope of a dental plan. It's a career with all the perks of a leaky thatched roof and the life expectancy of a mayfly. Perks? You want perks? Try no pension, no heroic ballads, and no evenings off. You couldn't exactly advertise your services unless you fancied being the main attraction at the next public hanging. The best you could hope for was that no one ever figured out what you did, especially not the innkeeper. Oh me, I'm a travelling dung merchant. Honest work, ignore the stains. So, why did you end up here? Because the world chewed you up, spat you out, and left you standing in a borrowed cloak with a knife you couldn't pawn. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the nameless, faceless dread that made people lock their doors and whisper over their ale if they remembered you at all. You want myth-busting? Here you go. Forget the visions of candlelit training in secret monasteries, surrounded by wise old men and motivational pan-flute music. There was no montage, no ancient order, no kindly mentor with a long beard and a handy lesson about the art of silence. If you learned anything, it was because you survived your own stupidity more than once. Most assassins weren't highly trained professionals. They were amateurs who figured out which floorboard squeaked and how not to sneeze at the wrong moment. If you'd served in a war, great, you might know which end of a knife goes in first. If not, stabbing was pretty self-explanatory. Escaping with your internal organs still internal, that was the real test, and the curriculum was mostly luck and a lot of running. Manuals? Guild training? Please? You didn't get an orientation or a team-building retreat. You got bruises, blisters, and a very close relationship with the kind of alleys that reeked of cabbage and regret. If you learned how to spot a decoy, or find the right bedroom, it was because you'd already blundered into the wrong one. Poison? That was the medieval equivalent of roulette. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the target just had a stomachache. Sometimes you forgot which cup to avoid, and spent the night hallucinating about talking goats. No medieval poison control either. Just hope, trial, error, and the occasional embarrassing funeral. If by some miracle you landed a mentor, it was usually some ancient cutthroat who lasted long enough to mutter a few pointers before disappearing, never to be seen again. Most assassins didn't retire. They simply vanished, usually because they were dead. Weapons training was equally glamorous. Forget swords and fancy daggers. You used whatever you could scrounge. A rusty blade, a knotted cord, Maybe a broken bottle if you were feeling creative. No one was handing out sword upgrades for Employee of the Month. You were just some grubby soul lurking in the dark, praying your boots didn't squeak. You survived not because you were trained, but because you learned to kill quickly, sloppily, and then disappear before anyone put up a wanted poster with your face on it. There were no graduation ceremonies, just the steady accumulation of bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping suspicion that you were entirely, irretrievably alone. Let's pause to address the real reason anyone became an assassin. Money. The promise of coin, that sweet heavy jangle, is what lured you into this mess. But here's the punchline. The coin was usually a lie. No one hired an assassin for a lasting partnership. They wanted a disposable solution, with no paperwork and absolutely no lingering witnesses, especially not the one who did the dirty work. If you were lucky, you got half your payment up front, the rest after the job. But after the job was medieval code for, once we're sure you didn't bungle it, get caught, or become a liability. So you'd sneak into some fortress, risk your life, maybe smother a noble in his own featherbed, and then return for your reward. And what did you get? More often than not, you got nothing. Your client vanished, or worse, they sent someone to silence you. Why pay when a knife in your back is cheaper than a bonus? Even if you did collect, it was never enough. Not for the risk, not for the shame, and certainly not for the 3 days you spent wallowing in a haystack with only fleas and regret for company. A handful of grubby coins, a dismissive nod, and a stern warning. Tell no one. Also, congratulations. Sometimes the contract itself was a trap. Perhaps you were sent to assassinate someone notorious, only to discover you'd been led straight into a trap, with guards lying in wait, and your name already penciled in for the executioner's schedule. Even on the rare occasion the job was real, you couldn't exactly sue for breach of contract. Imagine trying to explain that in court. Your Honour, Lord Reginald owes me hazard pay for that moat incident. The only court you'd see was the one with your neck in a noose. So, what did you do? You learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not the shadowy noble, not the cheerful scribe who swore this was an opportunity, and certainly not the friend who introduced you to this career. The only thing the job changed about your life was how short it became. Being a medieval assassin meant living on broken promises, perpetual paranoia, and the certainty that the only retirement plan involved a shallow grave. So, let's recap. You didn't become a legend. You didn't collect glory, medals, or even a decent set of teeth. You became a rumor, a whisper, a forgotten footnote in the margins of someone else's dramatic saga. History doesn't remember your name. It barely remembers you existed at all. And even then, it probably gets your story wrong. Now, if you're still determined to sign up for this line of work, you'd better get familiar with the tools of the trade, the kind of targets you'll be facing, and the endless parade of disguises you'll wear to keep yourself alive, because the lonely, paranoid life of an assassin is just getting started. So, you've taken the job. Congratulations. You've accepted the gig. No, you don't get hazard pay. No, there's no dental plan. And yes, you've been lied to about the risks, the rewards, and the odds of living long enough to regret your career choices. Welcome to the Assassin's Toolkit, where fantasy meets the flea market, and reality stinks of old onions and rust. First, let's shatter a few illusions. Forget what you've seen in movies. There are no hidden wrist blades that snap out with a satisfying click, no enchanted daggers with glowing runes, no smoke bombs conveniently disguised as apples. Your arsenal is whatever you can filch, sharpen, or conceal in the folds of a cloak that's older than your sense of hope. If you're lucky, by which I mean you've just tripped over a corpse with a coin purse, you might own a decent dagger, not a blade forged by mystical dwarves, but something straight, simple, and sharp enough to get the job done without snapping in half or reeking of its previous victim. Ornate, only if blood-stained chic is in vogue. As for poison, yes, it exists. But let's not romanticize it. There's no delicate dripping of venom into jeweled goblets beneath the flicker of candlelight. Medieval poison is a culinary roulette of dubious plants, minerals, and the occasional toad squeezed into the mix for good measure. Sometimes it works instantly. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just leaves your target retching for days, only to recover angrier, and now convinced the soup is plotting against them. If you're aiming for subtlety, be prepared for disappointment, and possibly for being chased out of town by a mob of amateur herpetologists. Rope, that workhorse of improvisation, occasionally features in your endeavors. You might use it to strangle, climb, or tie something down if you're feeling creative or desperate. But let's be honest, nothing kills the mood of a stealthy murder quite like fumbling with knots while your intended victim wriggles and asks, "Is that a slip knot or a granny?" If you have to consult a Boy Scout handbook mid-assassination, you're probably not cut out for the trade. Bows? Sure. They work if you've spent your misspent youth practicing. And if you can sneak one past the castle guards without someone asking why the flower arranger is packing long-range weaponry, most of your assignments are up close and personal. Less Robin Hood, more awkwardly intimate stabbing in the hallway. The elegant shot from the shadows is a luxury. You, meanwhile, are just trying not to slip in your own mess. And let's talk about backup plans. You don't get any. If your blade snaps or you drop it down a well at the worst possible moment, it's time to improvise. Slate roof tile, rusty nail, a boot buckle wielded with righteous desperation. Nothing is off the table. You'll contemplate murder by bread crust if the situation demands it. Your tools are stashed wherever you can manage, sewn into hems, tucked into boots, or hidden inside hollowed-out loaves if you're feeling especially inspired. But don't get attached. Your weapon is your silent partner, your only friend, and your sorry excuse for a pension plan. No upgrades, no magical smiths waiting to tweak your kit. All you can do is pray it doesn't betray you mid-swing. Because in the end, it's not the blade that matters. It's you, alone in the dark, expected to work wonders with a spoon and a muttered curse. Now let's talk targets. You're not being hired to deal with the neighborhood drunk or the guy who owes half the market a chicken. No, your list features nobles, bishops, military commanders, and if you're feeling particularly unlucky, royalty. These people are notoriously difficult to kill. They're surrounded by more security than a modern celebrity with a Twitter scandal. Guards everywhere, at the doors, the windows, pretending to arrange flowers, but really just itching for a reason to shout. Intruder. You'll become intimately familiar with patrol patterns, the sound of floorboards that creak, and which staircase makes the asthmatic guard pause for breath. You'll spend hours tracing routes, counting steps, and memorizing which corridor smells most strongly of boiled cabbage, because one wrong step, and it's all over. Sometimes in a literal head-on-a-pike sort of way. Then there's the matter of getting inside. Castles aren't built for open invitation. There are no cheerful doormats, only murder holes, portcullises, and moats teeming with things that bite, or at least give you a rash. If you manage not to drown, you still have to avoid the archers waiting to turn you into a pincushion. And let's not forget the ever-popular boiling oil. Your job description includes maybe flambéed for curiosity. But the guards are only the beginning. Inside you face the true terror. The staff, cooks, maids, scribes and stable boys, all of them with an uncanny ability to spot a stranger. If your disguise falters for even a moment, they'll be whispering to the guards faster than you can say, "I'm just here for the bread delivery." In the Middle Ages, gossip is the deadliest weapon. If it means saving their own skins, servants will turn you in before you can blink. And then, finally, the target. Paranoid doesn't begin to describe them. Surrounded by sycophants and bloodthirsty relatives, they trust no one. Food is tasted, rooms are locked and relocked, and some even sleep in decoy beds or rotate sleeping quarters like a grim game of musical chairs. If you hear they're hosting a feast, don't get excited. Yes, there will be drinking, but so will you, because you have to blend in with the revelers while keeping an eye on 3 royal guards, 2 dogs, a jester with trust issues, and 50 witnesses, all holding tankards and ready to scream at the first sign of trouble. Getting close to your target is a marathon of patience and nerves. It can take weeks, living among servants, bribing the right chambermaid, or squeezing yourself into a barrel for hours just to get a glimpse. And when the moment comes, you have exactly one shot. It must be silent, swift, and so clean that the only evidence left is a faint whiff of garlic and regret. Otherwise you'll find yourself swinging from the castle gate with a sign around your neck proclaiming, Nice try. Let's address the burning question. What did you look like? If you're picturing a sleek silhouette in black leather, hood drawn low, moving with feline grace, you're due for a disappointment. The truth is, you look like a malnourished goat herder with a guilty conscience. Disguises in the Middle Ages were less about style, more about whatever you could scrape together from the laundry pile. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 decades out of fashion, or a guard's tunic that still smells like its last, less fortunate occupant. These are your options. The goal wasn't to stand out, but to blend in with the unwashed masses. You're surrounded by people who haven't bathed in a month, hobble from old wounds, and flinch whenever someone raises their voice. You didn't look suspicious because of your clothes. You looked suspicious because you kept nervously readjusting your belt to hide the dagger wrapped in stale cheesecloth. If you tried to wear a mask, you'd be mistaken for a leper, or worse, a party crasher with very poor taste. There are no fancy masquerade options, just rags, hoods, and maybe a scarf if you're feeling bold. If someone challenges you, you improvise. I'm Brother Tobias, here for silent prayer and emergency roof repairs. It's not foolproof. Households are filled with sharp-eyed servants who know every face and every schedule. Fumble a chamber pot, forget the cook's cat's name, or look lost for a second, and someone is fetching the guard captain. The margin for error is razor thin. You're always a single. Who are you? Away from being bludgeoned with a candlestick by a surprisingly spry grandmother. And if your disguise does work, you're not home free. Now you must play your part, lingering in character for hours while the truly stab-worthy parade passed, just out of reach. Wigs? Not a chance. If you need to look older, you smear dirt on your face, squint a lot, and hope no one gets close enough to notice your fake beard is glued on with honey. In the end, your disguise buys you 5 minutes of confusion, not safety. After that, you better vanish, or be ready to improvise your way out of a very awkward arrest. And heaven help you if you're caught in the bishop's laundry, wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword. Not even a feast day can save you from that spectacle. You might be wondering, did you have a team? Maybe a loyal sidekick with a crossbow, or a wise old handler in a candle-lit den, feeding you cryptic notes and fatherly advice. Sorry, you're alone. No guild, no secret brotherhood at least, not one that ever returns your calls. The idea of an assassin's league is mostly the fever dream of bored tavern patrons after too much mead. You're more likely to meet a ghost in the back alley than a fellow professional keen to discuss trade secrets. Why the isolation? Because every extra person who knows your face is another chance at an early ugly death. You trust no one, not even your clients. If they know your real name, you're already plotting your exit. Friendship, a joke. Lovers ask inconvenient questions about bruises, bloodstains, and your habit of sleeping with a knife under the pillow. You can't settle down, can't afford it. One slip, one old acquaintance recognizing you at the bakery, and you're racing for the nearest sewer grate before the mob can light their torches. Even criminals prefer to keep you at arm's length. Thieves and smugglers have their own code. But you're the person who turns up, makes people vanish, and leaves everyone nervously counting their friends. No one wants to share stew with the walking embodiment of a bad omen, and don't expect sympathy. If you ever confide your woes to a stranger, they'll either laugh or faint. No one wants to hear about the trauma of garroting a bishop after midnight. You keep your secrets, your scars, and your grudges locked up tight. At the inn, you take the darkest corner, always facing the door. You never drink enough to lose your edge. You never linger more than a night. Your name is whatever someone pays to hear, and even then, it's probably a lie. Your true talent isn't in the blade or the disguise, but in vanishing, not just blending into a crowd, but erasing yourself from every life you never dared to live. The lonely, paranoid, perpetually improvising existence of a medieval assassin. No fame, no fortune, and certainly no happy endings. Just the cold satisfaction of surviving one more day until your luck runs out. And that, my friend, is just the gear and the gig, because next comes the part that really keeps you up at night. The high stakes, the consequences, and the often horrific realities that follow every job. So let's say you took the job. So you took the plunge, you accepted the contract, mapped out your path, slipped the right coins into the right palms, and for the finishing touch, donned the all-too-believable disguise of a soot-stained chimney sweep. You rehearsed every step in your mind, every moment choreographed for maximum efficiency and minimal bloodshed. Then, at the crucial second, you falter. Maybe your target spins around when they shouldn't. Maybe you spot their child clutching their tunic. Or maybe your hand betrays you and quivers like a terrified rabbit in a thunderstorm. Congratulations, you've just written your own death sentence. Because in the medieval world, a failed assassination wasn't a matter of being let go with a stern warning or a sad little note in your performance review file. No, failure meant you'd be treated to a public demise so inventive and spectacular it'd make even the most jaded executioner clap with glee. Theatrics were everything. Ropes, fire, wheels, and iron contraptions with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight awaited you. Devices engineered less for justice, more for entertainment, and a little light crowd therapy. Miss your mark, and you didn't just lose a paycheck, you detonated the whole plan. Your target, now very much alive, wasted no time broadcasting your attempt to anyone with ears and a few without. Suddenly your face, or at least a grotesque approximation of it, is immortalized in charcoal on every tavern wall within a 30-mile radius. Picture your likeness, lopsided, bug-eyed, and sporting a beard you never had, captioned with that classic phrase, wanted, probably armed, definitely unlucky, and the guards. Remember those sleepy, bored sentries you eased past on your way in? Now they're energized, motivated, and, worst of all, highly incentivized to catch you. Your botched attempt has transformed you from a nameless shadow into public enemy number one, a walking cautionary tale for any would-be troublemaker. But don't get too fixated on the guards, because sometimes it wasn't the target or the authorities you needed to fear, it was your own employer. The person who paid you, the one who whispered in shadowy corners, is now eyeing you like a leaky barrel of secrets. You're no longer an asset, you've become a liability, a mouth that could spill, under the right combination of pain and persuasion, every detail of the conspiracy. In fact, don't be surprised when you learn that your client has already put out a second contract, this time on you. Second chances? In this line of work, those are as real as functional medieval plumbing. Sorry, my hand slipped. I'll try again tomorrow is not a phrase you get to utter. You have one chance, one fleeting window in which to be perfect. Anything less, and you might as well tattoo a bullseye on your back and start rehearsing your last words. And don't even think your prior successes will buy you grace. Killed 12 men before, outsmarted a dozen guards last spring. No one cares. In the assassin's ledger, you're only as good as your most recent job. If your last job was a failure, you're not just forgotten, you're actively erased. But let's pretend you pull it off. The plan clicks. Your blade finds its mark. The target drops, silent and unceremonious. No alarms, no heroic last words, just a sudden vacancy in the local noble hierarchy. Mazel tov, now start running. Because medieval assassin glory doesn't look like the movies. There's no rooftop wine, no brooding over the city skyline as everything burns behind you. There's only the frantic scramble down filthy alleys, with someone else's blood soaking your boots and a pack of dogs already catching your scent. There's no victory lap, no banter with assassin colleagues at the pub, no casual debrief with your benefactor. You don't even get a moment to admire your handiwork. Once the deed is done, your sole purpose becomes not dying in the next 10 minutes, as the entire city pivots from ignorant bliss to full lockdown mode. Remember those exits you planned? You'd better, because now every door is barred, every gate guarded by men who just received your worst portrait, and a warning, maybe armed and extremely stabby. If you're lucky, you plotted a backup route, bribed a boatman who's too nosy to ask questions, or at least found a hayloft to hide in while the city's paranoia boils over. Because within minutes, your world will shrink to a handful of alleys, and the constant pounding certainty that everyone is looking for you, and the client, assuming they're not busy arranging your untimely demise, you're unlikely to find them waiting with a grateful handshake and a bonus. more likely they'll vanish, leaving you to wonder if the bag of coins they promised ever existed. Because an assassin who's just demonstrated how easily they can slip past security is suddenly the most dangerous person in the city. You know too much, you've seen too much, and your skills are now a liability to everyone who once benefited from them. So what do you win? A week, if you're lucky, of sleeping in haylofts that smell like goat, bribing ferrymen with your last coin, scraping off your beard in the dark, and perfecting your best impression of Brother Lucian, the world's most suspicious monk. Because in the end, success doesn't mean safety. It means you get to start the game all over again, in a new city where your face is only slightly less infamous, and your enemies are just a little more creative. The only thing you can count on is that your notoriety will travel faster than you ever could, carried on the lips of gossiping fishwives and suspicious innkeepers. Yes, you made the kill. Now run as though the devil himself is nipping at your heels. And if all that wasn't quite miserable enough, the poverty, the constant flight, the existential dread, there's the beautiful Baroque cocktail of paranoia that medieval society reserved for your kind. Assassins weren't just feared, they were regarded as supernatural abominations, the sort of shadowy figures who whispered bargains to demons or slathered frog entrails onto their knives under a blood-red moon. Because how else could you stalk the night and slip through locked doors, if not for some unholy pact? Logic, after all, was about as fashionable in the Middle Ages as bathing. To the average villager, you weren't merely a killer, you were a living hex, a walking curse wrapped in a cloak. Some whispered that assassins could turn invisible, unless of course someone doused them in holy water. Others swore you could shapeshift into a black dog or a crow, slipping through the streets unseen. One particularly popular tale insisted that assassins breathed death through walls, striking down victims from the other side of the stone. Picture yourself strolling through a muddy market square, only to have the local midwife hiss, "Don't look at him, he'll put a hex on your baby." Even your tools were suspect. That dagger on your belt, clearly forged by goblins. The little vial of poison, witchcraft no doubt, brewed with grave dirt and stirred with a severed toe beneath an eclipsed moon. You might think all this fear would work in your favor. Keep people at arm's length, make them too frightened to interfere, but you'd be wrong. Superstitious mobs don't pause for explanations. They don't debate. They reach for torches, pick up stones, and shriek. Burn him before he calls down lightning. The moment someone died unexpectedly, be it illness, accident, or a particularly treacherous chicken bone, someone would begin to whisper. Maybe it was the Shadow Man. Maybe it was him. Just being present in a village when fate struck someone down could make you the next target, so you kept moving. Always. Lingering too long meant risking the wrath of a bell-ringing priest and a handful of farmers who'd been waiting their whole lives for a reason to swing a pitchfork. Heaven forbid you were caught with anything even remotely odd. Dried herbs, strange coins, or saints preserve you, a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout sorcerer and reach for the kindling. In a world where monsters were expected to wear human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too quick was enough to make you the enemy. And when medieval logic decided you were a threat, there was only one acceptable outcome: swift, fiery annihilation. It's not a glamorous life, is it? No glory, no retirement, no fanfare. Just a parade of crude wanted posters, breathless rumors, and the ever-present suspicion that your next disguise will be your last. But if you thought the danger ended with the blade, you haven't begun to grasp the true legacy of the assassin. Because after the deed, after the flight, comes the slow, corrosive poison of betrayal and oblivion. And speaking of poison, let's raise a glass. Not in celebration, but in mockery. Because when it comes to assassination, the toast is always poisoned, and the only thing you're drinking is your own impending doom. You want to imagine yourself the shadowy hand behind the throne, a master of the silent kill, the elegant deliverer of justice with a vial of deadly toxin. But let me, history, drag you through the reality. You're not swirling a goblet of vintage malice in a candlelit chamber. You're hunched over a splintered table, grinding roots and scraping fungus into a foul-smelling paste, praying that tonight's batch doesn't kill the wrong person. Welcome to the assassin's legacy, paranoia, betrayal, and the sweet oblivion of being forgotten. You see, poison has always been painted as the assassin's weapon of choice. Subtle, sophisticated, civilized. Just a drop, a shiver, a discreet cough, and your mark is history. That's the myth, anyway. The truth is that medieval poison was about as reliable as predicting the weather by licking a rock. You're not working with tidy vials of fast-acting death. You've got foxglove, hemlock, a handful of dubious berries, and if you're really lucky, some arsenic that hasn't been diluted with chalk by the merchant who sold it to you. You're guessing dosages by eyeball and superstition. One pinch too little and your target gets nothing but a sour stomach and a renewed appreciation for his food tasters. One pinch too much and you're the one doubled over, convulsing on the kitchen floor before the main course is even served. Forget slipping in unseen too. Medieval kitchens were less Downton Abbey and more battlefield triage center. Cooks, scullions, dogs and the occasional livestock all jostling for space. The noble's meal wasn't a plate, it was a gauntlet. The food passed through hands, noses, mouths, sometimes even a priest's blessing and a jester's sniff for good measure. You want to sneak nightshade into the soup? Good luck. The stew has to survive 3 human tasters, and yes, a dog's discerning palate before it reaches the high table. If the mutt keels over, congratulations, you've just poisoned the Lord's favorite animal and drawn more suspicion than a monk at a brothel. But let's suspend disbelief. Imagine you manage it. The poison is administered, the mark swallows it down, and for a moment you feel the rush of destiny. Except now, the real gamble begins. Medieval poisons weren't punctual. Some killed in minutes, others in days. One moment your target is regaling the hall with an off-color joke. The next, he's clutching his gut, pale and sweating, demanding a prayer and a chamber pot. Maybe he dies. Maybe he recovers. And if he does, who do you think he'll blame? Not the hapless cook, not the fool who tasted the stew. No, he'll remember you, the stranger with the herbalist satchel and the haunted eyes. You might as well tattoo suspicion on your forehead. And if you get caught, don't expect a quick, dignified end. The Middle Ages had a real flair for creative interrogation. Iron pincers, heated tongs, and a long list of questions delivered with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious festivals. They'll want to know everyone you've ever met, every client you've served, every animal you've poisoned. Who hired you? Who paid you? Did you act alone? Or is there a vast conspiracy involving the baker, the blacksmith, and half the local clergy? You'll confess to poisoning everyone from the baron to the stable cat, just to make it stop. But let's say you pulled it off. Let's say you changed the course of a dynasty. A king dead, a prince silenced, a rival faction scattered to the wind. You'd expect a story, a song, at least a sinister footnote in the chronicles. But you're the assassin. Your name wasn't just meant to be forgotten. It was engineered to be erased. You're not a legend. You're a rumor. A hooded figure glimpsed in a storm. The silent man who drank alone. Or the foreigner who never smiled. You could have orchestrated the most pivotal murder of the century, and your reward is a single line in the record. Sudden illness, cause unknown. This is not an accident. Your client didn't want a famous killer. They wanted a loose end tied up and plausible deniability. The fewer who knew, the better. The more invisible you were, the safer they felt. If your real name slipped into the wind, it was only so it could be cursed as a warning. Don't cross the Duke. Remember what happened to Lord Edric, and the man who made it happen. Already a ghost, already forgotten. So, what is your legacy? Not fame, not even fear. Your greatest achievement is to be a gap, a hole in the tapestry, an absence so complete that people struggle to remember if you ever existed. You're not supposed to leave a mark. You're supposed to vanish. If you linger long enough to be recognized, congratulations, you've just become someone else's problem. In the medieval world, heroes were commemorated, assassins were expunged. You might as well have never drawn breath. Suppose you survived the job. You slip into the night, coins clinking in your pouch, your employer nodding in icy satisfaction. You think you're done? You're just getting started. Because if there's one iron rule in the assassin's handbook, it's this: never trust anyone, especially not the person who hired you. Your client wasn't motivated by friendship, respect, or even gratitude. They needed a problem solved, and the instant you delivered, you became the new problem. You knew too much. You knew who wanted whom dead, and you knew how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous. That made you disposable. What happens next? You're ghosted, medieval style. Maybe your client denies ever meeting you. Maybe they send someone else to tie off the contract, this time with a dagger instead of a purse of coins. There are even stories of double contracts. Assassin A kills the target, Assassin B kills Assassin A, and everyone goes home slightly safer, except of course for you. Refunds aren't part of the deal. Erasure is. And if you make the fatal error of trying to squeeze your client for more threatening to expose them, perhaps they don't negotiate, they crush you. You're not a trusted agent. You're a liability on two legs. If by some cosmic joke your client is the rare endangered species of noble with an actual sense of honor, you might just get paid and left alive. Maybe. But you can bet someone is always watching you from the shadows, memorizing your gait, noting your favorite watering hole, ready to step in if you so much as hint at trouble. You're the secret that can never surface, the shadow that must disappear. To them, you are the sword of Damocles, and nobody wants to sleep with that hanging overhead. If you killed once, you could kill again. And who's to say your next target won't be the very hand that once fed you? Let's stretch credibility further. Assume you've outlasted your enemies, outmaneuvered your clients, dodged every blade meant for your back. What then? Retirement? A cozy cottage by the sea? Don't make me laugh. Medieval assassins didn't get pensions or golden handshakes. You didn't fade into a gentle old age. You faded into nothingness. You vanished or you died. Usually both. The problem is simple. You are never safe. You can walk away from the job, but the job never walks away from you. Your head is a brimming cauldron of secrets. Your hands forever stained. No one wants you retired. Everyone wants you erased. And even if by some miracle, no one comes looking, you're left with a constant gnawing fear. Every knock at the door, every stranger's glance, every rumor of a new killer in town, each one could be the beginning of your end. You change your name, your hair, your walk. You move to a village where no one asks questions, pretending you once worked as a guard, selling herbs to gullible peasants. But you never sleep deeply. You always sit with your back to the wall, a dagger under the floorboard, coins stashed in a pouch you never dare spend, because it still smells like betrayal. And then there's you. Yes, you. You can't trust even yourself. Years of living in the margins, always looking over your shoulder, have rewired your brain. You flinch at every sudden sound. You see threats in every shadow. You stop dreaming because in your dreams, you're always being hunted. You can't laugh, can't love, can't even relax for fear of who might be watching. You live as a wraith in your own life, a ghost haunting the living. There's no endgame here, no triumph, just a slow, silent fade into anonymity. You drift from town to town, never staying long enough to grow roots. Always careful, always wary, until one day you slip away unnoticed, unmissed, and maybe in this bleak tale, that's the closest thing to peace you'll ever get. By now, you must see through the Hollywood haze. The assassin's life wasn't daring, or glamorous, or even all that lucrative. It was a grim, joyless grind, a career that chewed up its practitioners and spat out only shadows. You wouldn't last a week. You'd show up with your cloak and your grand ideas, only to run straight into the mud, the chaos, and the endless parade of betrayals. You'd be cold, hungry, and one unlucky slip away from the gallows. Your information would be outdated, your contacts unreliable, and the local stable boy would sell you out for a crust of bread and the story of a lifetime. You'd freeze when you needed to act. You'd stab the wrong man, get spotted by a washerwoman who once saw your face at a market. Before you know it, you're not the hunter, you're the hunted. You run, but the medieval streets are a minefield of mud, cobblestones and yes, an improbable number of chickens with a grudge. You slip, you fall, and a guard named Thomas, who's nursing his own heartbreak, is more than happy to take you down. Survive that, and you're looking at a future of suspicion, whispered curses, and the bitter knowledge that if you succeed, your greatest reward is to die old and alone, hiding behind a lie in a town that still believes in elves. No, you wouldn't last, and honestly, you shouldn't try. The assassin's trade wasn't cool. It was a bleak machine that devoured its own. It offered power without peace, purpose without place. You didn't make history, you deleted yourself from it. The only thing waiting at the end was silence, a silence so deep, so absolute, that no one even bothered to ask where you went. So, as you slink away into the fog of oblivion, take comfort in this. You were never meant to be remembered. You were the blade in the dark, the whisper in the hall, the ghost with no name. And when you finally vanished, it was as if you had never existed at all. Speaking of legacies built on shadows and ruthless ambition, let's turn our gaze from the forgotten to the infamous. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a Molossian princess from the wild, tribal lands of Epirus. But how did a foreign girl with a gift for myth and menace become one of the most formidable women in history? Let's drag you through the mud, the blood, and the tangled roots of Olympias' origins, and rise to power. Before you wielded the scepter of Macedon, before the world whispered your name in both awe and terror, you were simply Molossian royalty, Myrtale, daughter of Epirus. Your homeland wasn't the flat, sun-drenched olive groves of Greek poets, but a jagged, pine-choked landscape where the wind shrieked through mountain passes, and every rock seemed to remember a blood feud. The Molossians, your people, didn't just invent stories, they lived them. They claimed Achilles as an ancestor, and you grew up with the uneasy sense that heroism was less a birthright than a curse. Whether you actually bore the blood of the demigod or just inherited the family talent for dramatic comebacks, one thing was clear: you were not built for a background role in anyone's epic. Your childhood was less a royal idol than a preparatory trial by superstition. While other noble girls embroidered dreams into golden thread, you learned to read the flicker of torchlight, the hiss of snakes, the murmurs of women in trance, because in Epirus, the gods weren't distant. They were present, hungry, and frankly, a little unhinged. Your days blurred between the sacred and the profane. You were inducted into the mysteries of Dionysus, where the line between worship and possession evaporated. Barefoot, you danced in moonlit groves, the air thick with the scent of crushed time and sweat, surrounded by priestesses who shrieked invocations to gods who might be listening or just bored. For you, ritual wasn't theatre, it was survival. The cult of Dionysus wasn't just your spiritual home, it was your power base. And let's be honest, you didn't just attend rites, you owned them. The legends say you slept with sacred snakes, letting them coil around your body, as if you were a living altar. Was this historical fact, or the fevered fantasy of men terrified by a woman who refused to behave? Who can say? But the rumor outlasted the truth, as rumors always do. To your supporters, you became a vessel of the divine. To your enemies, you were something darker, something the poets didn't know how to name. Either way, you were unforgettable. Your real ascent didn't begin in a throne room, or even on a battlefield. No, it started in the shadows, in torchlit circles where prophecies curled like smoke and priestesses whispered futures no one else dared voice. You weren't just a princess. You were a living oracle, a human boundary between the mundane and the monstrous. And even the most ambitious men, especially the most ambitious men, couldn't resist the lure of that. Enter Philip II of Macedon, a man whose ambition was rivaled only by his libido and his capacity for violence. He arrived on Samothrace, not for conquest, but for initiation into the island's secret rites, a pilgrimage for power, or perhaps just an excuse to add another line to his already baroque resume. There, among the chanting, the sweat, and the rumor of gods lurking just out of sight, your destinies collided. Philip, the conqueror, you, the enigma. The result wasn't just a marriage, it was an explosion, a collision of prophecy, passion, and political calculation that would rattle the ancient world. Of course, this was no fairy tale union. The omens started immediately. Some said that on your wedding night, lightning split the sky as if Zeus himself was giving a thunderous thumbs up. Others whispered that you dreamed of a thunderbolt entering your womb. Whether these stories were fevered gossip, wishful thinking, or just post-wedding PR, they stuck. And why not? The idea that your child would be touched by divinity was far more useful than any dry genealogical chart. You, or perhaps your enemies, ensured the myths were repeated until even the stone-cold skeptics considered them plausible. Your marriage to Philip wasn't a union. It was a contest. Philip, with his collection of wives and a personality as subtle as a siege engine, didn't marry for love. He married for power. And he married often. You, however, were no one's trophy. You established your own court, gathered your own loyalists, and kept your rituals alive, even in the stony heart of Pella. Macedon wasn't a kingdom so much as a war zone with better curtains. The palace seethed with intrigue. Brothers murdered brothers, cousins plotted over wine, and the only certainty was that loyalty could be purchased, but never owned. You played the game as well as any man. You consulted oracles, you performed rites. You read omens in the entrails of sacrificial animals, and the way the wind rattled the palace shutters. And when Alexander was born, you wrapped him not just in swaddling cloth, but in legend. Flames danced around his cradle, they said, and he was untouched. Philip dreamed of sealing your womb with a lion, because metaphor, like politics, was best served overcomplicated. Did you believe these stories? Maybe. Did you use them? Absolutely. But even as your son's legend grew, so too did the cracks in your marriage. Philip had a talent for collecting grievances and wives in equal measure. The last straw came when he married Cleopatra Eurydice, a local Macedonian noble, not to be confused with the more famous Cleopatra of Egypt. This was more than just a personal slight. Cleopatra's Macedonian blood made her a threat, her offspring a potential rival to your own son. In the brutal calculus of ancient succession, children were weapons, and mothers were their wielders. The marriage feast was a disaster, even by Macedonian standards. At the drunken height of the celebrations, Attalus, Cleopatra's uncle, and one of Philip's top generals, raised a toast that was less congratulation than provocation. He cast doubt on Alexander's legitimacy, suggesting your son was less the product of a king than the bastard of a god, a slur, but also a gift. You seized the myth and twisted it to your advantage. If Alexander was not Philip's, he was Zeus's. Let them whisper. Let them fear. Alexander stormed out of the feast. You, ever the strategist, retreated to Epirus. But this wasn't surrender. It was regrouping. In your homeland, you were still a queen. You gathered support, fanned the flames of rumor, and waited as Macedon began to eat itself from within. You didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Your absence was a weapon all its own. Then came the murder. Philip, on the eve of his greatest campaign, just as he was about to crown himself not merely king of Macedon, but would-be emperor of the known world, was struck down at his daughter's wedding. The assassin was Pausanias, a bodyguard with a personal grudge. But in the palace, the echoing question was not who wielded the dagger, but who placed it in his hand. Was it you? Was it Alexander? Was it the work of courtiers, scorned lovers, or just the inevitable backlash against a man whose enemies outnumbered his friends? No one knew. No one dared ask, but many believed it. And with Philip's corpse barely cold, you moved. Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead within days. The manner of their deaths was depending on which ancient chronicler you believe. Either public, humiliating, or both. One version has you forcing Cleopatra to hang herself after witnessing her infant's murder. Another claims you ordered the child thrown upon a funeral pyre. All sources agree there was no mercy. In the palace, compassion was a liability, and sentimentality a death sentence. You understood that, and you acted accordingly. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, the path was clear for Alexander. But don't be fooled by the later portraits of your son as a born king. His ascension wasn't inevitable, it was engineered. You threatened generals, flattered nobles, and disposed of enemies with a precision that made mere soldiers look like amateurs. Alexander was young, bold, and dazzling, but it was your ruthlessness that paved his way to the throne. He might have disapproved of the bloodshed, but he also didn't stop it. Deep down, he understood what you had always known. Power is paid for in blood, and in Macedon, bloodlines are both the currency and the debt. With your son crowned, you faded ever so slightly from the public spotlight. But this was no gentle retirement to the garden. You simply refined your methods. The daggers went from visible to invisible. The threats became whispers. You became less a fixture of the court, more its ghost, the veiled hand behind the throne, the matriarch whose approval or disfavor could still make or unmake careers. As Alexander prepared to launch his world-conquering campaign, you remained in Macedon, but not as a passive queen mother. You were the guardian of his destiny, the spiritual firewall between your son and the countless threats he'd left behind. You sent him sacred relics, communed with oracles, and performed rites from afar. To you, this wasn't just a military expedition. It was prophecy made flesh. Alexander wasn't simply going to war. He was fulfilling the destiny you had shaped for him since before his first breath. Every enemy slain, every city burned, every victory won. These were not just his legacy, but yours. You had crowned your son with blood, cleansed the palace with fire, and now as the world trembled beneath his feet, you watched from the shadows, guarding the empire with teeth bared and eyes unblinking. In the game of power, you had rewritten the rules. No one would ever call you Myrtale again. You were Olympia's, and every snake in Macedon slithered in your shadow. So, as the dust settled over Philip's grave and Alexander set his sights eastward, you remained unyielding, enigmatic, and still somehow the most dangerous person in the palace, because in the world of kings and gods, the greatest power often belonged not to those who held the sword, but to those who whispered when to draw it. And speaking of power behind the throne, as Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained behind in Macedon. But if you thought her story was finished, you haven't been paying attention. In the next chapter, we'll see how the Queen Mother's final gambit would echo across generations, and how her legacy, like her serpents, would prove impossible to kill. So here you are, Olympia's Queen Mother, not a sovereign in name perhaps, but let's not pretend you ever needed a title to rule. Titles are for people who require permission. You, on the other hand, are Macedon's original force of nature. As Alexander charges eastward, swallowing up the world like an insatiable storm, you remain behind, the fulcrum on which the old power rests. Officially, you're the Queen Mother, a ceremonial relic. In practice, you wield the kind of influence that makes generals sweat in their sleep. The regency, some polite fiction that's supposed to keep things tidy, lands in the lap of Antipater, Alexander's grizzled and perpetually exasperated lieutenant. You can almost hear him muttering about the good old days, before every decision required outmaneuvering a woman who seems to have a sixth sense for treachery. You Olympias do not take kindly to being sidelined. Instead, you do what all great powers do when exiled from the battlefield. You turn to the pen and the oracle. Your letters to Alexander are not the gentle reminders of a doting mother. Oh no, they're more like dispatches from the highest command, laced with prophecy and venom, advising, warning, sometimes outright chastising. You question his taste in friends, his dangerous fascination with Persian ways, his marriages to foreign princesses, and most pointedly, his growing tendency to let people call him a god. No one else would dare. But you, Olympias, queen by birth and priestess by vocation, are not bound by fear. Alexander, thousands of miles away, reads every word. And while he's busy toppling empires, your voice is the one that echoes in his head. You remind him who his real enemies are. You nudge, you prod, you sow doubt among his companions. You never let him forget that the gods and his mother are always watching. Meanwhile, Antipater grows increasingly resentful. He's supposed to be running Macedon, not tiptoeing around a queen mother with a taste for intrigue and a Rolodex of aristocratic contacts stretching from Epirus to Thessaly. He can order armies to march, but you can turn a rumor into a civil war before breakfast. In Macedon, a whisper from Olympias is deadlier than 1,000 spears. Your letters become more urgent, more insistent. You warn Alexander that Antipater is no loyal retainer, but another Philip in the making, a usurper waiting for the right moment to strike. Maybe you believe it. Maybe you simply refuse to loosen your grip. Either way, you keep pushing. Alexander, ever the pragmatist, hesitates. He needs Antipater for now, to keep the home front from collapsing while he carves up Asia. But the rift between you and the old general grows wider by the season. You watch, you wait, you do not forgive. After all, you didn't spend your life outwitting snakes and surviving palace coups to be bossed around by a soldier with a bad haircut. As Alexander's empire stretches from the Ionian coast to the edge of India, you see the fissures forming. He's trusting too many foreigners, listening to new gods, and worst of all, forgetting the mother and the divine blood that made him. You believe, with the conviction of a zealot and the exhaustion of a parent, that his victories are owed to you and the gods you serve. And if he needs reminding, well, Olympias has never been shy about reminders, even when the recipient is her own son. Then, inevitably, history delivers its cruelest blow. The news arrives not like a trumpet, but like a silent, icy knife. Alexander is dead in Babylon, 323 BCE. For you, it's not just the loss of a child, it's the evaporation of an entire universe. Your prophecy incarnate, your son the living thunderbolt, is gone. And he's left behind nothing but fragments. No clear heir, no binding legacy, just chaos and the howling of jackals over the corpse of his empire. Antipater still holds Macedon and Greece, and he's never missed an opportunity to make your life difficult. Worse, your daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, not the Egyptian one, try to keep up, is now a pawn for every ambitious general looking to marry into the bloodline and slap a crown on his head. The grand contest for the spoils of Alexander's conquest is underway, and everyone is sharpening their daggers. You see it for what it is. Civil war isn't coming. It's already here, and you're right in the middle of it. You don't have Alexander anymore. What you have is his bloodline, his infant son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess, who is now as vulnerable as a lamb in a den of wolves. The boy is both a target and a weapon. You forge an alliance with Roxana, determined to protect her and the child, but also to wield the boy's birthright as your own last desperate bid for power. But the generals, once content to bow and scrape, now have armies, ambitions, and a taste for blood. They have no interest in kneeling to a grieving widow or a mother haunted by visions. You don't flinch. You've faced worse. You've outlasted kings, survived betrayals, and turned poison into an art form. If Macedon must be ruled by the sharpest mind in the room, well, you're still here. Let the warlords come. So you plot, you wait, you watch the chessboard move. Antipater dies, finally, and his son Cassander steps into the ring. A man so cold you could store fish in his gaze. Unlike his father, he has no patience for your games. It is only a matter of time before you and Cassander collide. The serpent matriarch versus the calculating usurper. Alexander is gone, but his shadow lingers. And in that shadow, you're still coiled, waiting for your chance to strike. Years pass. The empire fractures. Your enemies circle. Then, with the regency splintered and Cassander consolidating his grip, you launch your last audacious move. You return to Macedon, not as a supplicant, not as a mother in mourning, but as a political force wreathed in divine fury. It's the final gambit. Ally yourself with Polyperchon, a veteran general who still commands a sliver of legitimacy. With his backing, you march into Macedon at the head of an army. The effect is electric. Towns open their gates. Soldiers, remembering the name Olympias, defect to your cause. Even your old adversaries hesitate, unwilling to face a legend with nothing left to lose. For a moment, just long enough to taste victory, you hold Macedon in your grasp. Then comes the vengeance. One by one, you hunt down Cassander's loyalists. When you finally catch Philip III Aridius, Alexander's half-brother and puppet king, you do what you do best. You stage his execution as a piece of divine theatre. His wife, Eurydice, is captured and offered the chance to die by her own hand. She refuses. You have her strangled. Brutality, yes, but dressed up in the ceremonial robes of royal justice. The message is unmistakable. Only Alexander's blood is fit to rule. Everything else is dross. For that brief, incandescent moment, you are again the architect of destiny. You've restored the dynasty, avenged betrayals, and shown Macedon the face of a queen who refuses to die quietly. But in Macedon, power burns fast, and the fire always finds more fuel. Cassander is not content to watch. He returns, his army larger, his treasury deeper, his malice colder. Your allies desert you. Polyperchon fades into irrelevance. The tide turns. Soon you're isolated, walled up in the coastal fortress of Pydna, the last outpost of your crumbling ambition. Surrounded by Cassander's men, you endure. Hunger gnaws at your garrison. Disease seeps through the stones. Your friends abandon you, one by one. Because as you may have noticed, loyalty in Macedon tends to evaporate when the food runs out. But inside those walls, you carry yourself as you always have. Not a prisoner, not a victim, but the mother of a god. Cassander, for all his ruthlessness, hesitates. Killing Olympias means risking the wrath of legend. You're not just a woman, you're a symbol. So he makes an offer. Surrender, and your life will be spared. You know better. You've seen royal promises turn to ash with the flick of a tongue. But the siege can't last forever. Hunger is no longer a threat. It's a certainty. Your followers capitulate. The gates of Pydna creak open, and you, unbowed to the end, are handed over to your enemies. Cassander, ever the bureaucrat of brutality, refuses to dirty his own hands. He turns you over to the families of your victims, the ones you executed when you retook power. Let them decide. They do not hesitate to condemn you, but when it comes time to actually do the deed, a strange paralysis grips them. You stand before them, not as a frail old woman, but as the living embodiment of all their childhood fears. The queen who slept with snakes, the priestess who called down omens, the mother of a god. The executioners falter. No one wants to be the first to strike. In that moment, myth and memory are stronger than steel. Cassander, exasperated and impatient, brings in outsiders, mercenaries with no skin in the game, no memory of your power. It's they who finally carry out the sentence. There's no drama, no royal display, just silence, a brief hesitation, and then the end. A legend extinguished not with a roar, but with a hush. With your death, the last ember of Alexander's bloodline is snuffed out. The empire you helped forge, the myth you tended like a jealous flame, collapses into history's ash heap. But here's the thing about myth. It doesn't die with the body. Even as the dust settles, you remain, a shadow on the walls of every throne room, a whisper in every palace intrigue. Olympias dies not robed in silk or crowned with laurels, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, executed by hands too afraid to face her. And yet history does not reserve its memory for those who die in comfort. Sometimes it's the ones who go down hissing that endure. You Olympias were never destined for quiet oblivion. In life you wielded motherhood as a blade, and prophecy as a shield. Without you, there is no Alexander the Great as we know him, no divine child, no lightning-augured king, no trail of corpses and rivals cleared for a teenage monarch. You didn't just birth an empire, you defended it, tooth and claw. Among the ancient world's great dynasts, you stand apart. You never led armies into battle, never donned armor, or rode into the fray. Your battlefield was the cold, perfumed corridors of power, poison, marriage, priesthood, rumor. You understood the currency of fear, and more importantly, the economy of belief. You made people believe your son was more than human. Perhaps, sometimes, you believed it yourself. Your enemies called you a murderer, a witch, a manipulator. They weren't wrong. You were all these things, and then some. A product of a world that valued cunning over compassion, strength over sentiment. You learned early and often that mercy is a luxury reserved for the powerless. Centuries later, you are both demonized and lionized, villain to some, visionary to others, but irrelevant. Never. You haunt Alexander's legend like a ghost with unfinished business, always in the background, always pulling strings. And perhaps that's your truest legacy, not as a tragic mother or a mere footnote in a king's tale, but as a legend in your own right. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, who slept with serpents, who outlasted gods and kings alike. Your bones have long since crumbled to dust, but your legend endures, coiled in every tale of ruthless queens, every murmur of blood and destiny, every empire built on the whisper of myth. History remembers you not as a footnote, but as a warning, a lesson, and sometimes a promise. In every shadow behind every throne, you are still there waiting. And speaking of palaces haunted by myth, let's leave Macedon's cold stone corridors for something older and perhaps even stranger. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a real place. But don't get comfortable. The truth behind these ancient stones is anything but mythical comfort. Welcome back, you poor unsuspecting soul, dragged once again by me, history, through the sun-bleached bones of Crete. Let's set the stage. Just a handful of winding roads south of modern-day Heraklion, you stumble onto a ruin that feels like it was dreamed up by a feverish architect with a grudge against straight lines. Here, nothing makes sense. Corridors veer off and vanish. Rooms double back on themselves. Staircases promise grandeur, then dead end into blank walls or empty space. Lose your bearings for 5 minutes, and congratulations, you're lost, just like everyone else for 4,000 years. Welcome to the Palace of Knossos, the tangled heart of the Minoan world, and depending on whom you ask, the birthplace of one of humanity's greatest monster stories, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. Now, before the myth crept in and muddied the waters, Knossos was something else entirely. Picture it. Around 1900 BCE, a palace rises from the Cretan earth. Not a castle with a moat and a brooding king. Not a squat, grim fortress. No, this is a palace so sprawling it might as well be a self-contained city, wrapped in one enormous, baffling package. We're talking nearly 150,000 square feet. Yes, that's not a typo. Housing more than 1,000 rooms. Light wells pour sunshine into shadowed halls. Storage magazines hoard the wealth of an empire. Shrines and workshops hum with ritual and industry. And, because the Minoans weren't about to settle for dark corners and chamber pots, there's running water, multi-story apartments, and even the earliest known flushing toilets. That's right, indoor plumbing before the Greeks could even spell hygiene. This isn't some primitive hovel, it's a marvel of design. Air flows where it should, light dances down painted walls, and every turn seems calculated to dazzle and confound in equal measure. Archaeologists today look at Knossos and see organized chaos, but for visitors back then, it must have felt like alchemy. Or maybe, just maybe, like magic whispered into stone. Enter Arthur Evans, British archaeologist with a taste for drama and a knack for naming things. In the early 1900s, Evans put spade to soil and quickly decided he'd unearthed the myth. This was, surely, the labyrinth itself. The place is disorienting, the architecture a puzzle box, and everywhere you look bulls painted on frescoes, carved into the walls, dangling as tiny golden charms from long-lost necklaces. The bull was sacred here, and Evans wasn't shy about connecting the dots. He even dubbed the people who built all this, their name lost to time, after the legendary King Minos. Whether Minos was ever real, or just a convenient container for collective anxiety, doesn't matter. The legend and the ruins are now joined at the hip, but here's where I, history, toss a wrench into your Hollywood expectations. Despite a century of digging, no one's ever unearthed a literal labyrinth beneath Knossos, no underground maze, no prison cells brimming with the gnawed bones of Athenian teenagers. And as for the half-man, half-bull monstrosity, not so much as a suspiciously large femur. What you get instead is a palace deliberately designed to bewilder. Wings and corridors loop and twist. Layers stack atop one another like a filo pastry from hell. Navigation is a nightmare, unless of course you live here and know the tricks. So was the Minotaur spawned from these walls? Or was the palace itself the monster, an architectural predator, devouring the sanity of anyone foolish enough to step inside. Knossos doesn't answer, it just raises more questions. And that's what makes it genius, a ruin that refuses to explain itself, forcing you to squint at the boundaries where history melts into myth. Everyone knows the story, or at least the sanitized, Disney-fied version. There's a labyrinth so intricate no one escapes. Deep inside, a minotaur part man, part bull hunts and devours unlucky victims. Only Theseus, with a ball of thread and a dash of royal cunning from Princess Ariadne, manages to slay the beast and escape. It's heroic, it's tragic, it's got everything except any basis in reality that you can actually dig up from the dirt. But where did this tale emerge from, and why did it stick? Early versions of the myth center on King Minos, a ruler so rich and powerful that Athens had to send 7 boys and 7 girls every year as tribute snacks for his pet monster. Born out of divine punishment and family shame, the Minotaur, locked away in a maze, becomes a symbol for all the darkness that lurks behind a polished throne. And to the Greeks, Crete itself, home of the Minoans, was a land of riches, rituals, and uncanny customs. The seafaring Cretans seemed elegant but alien. From the perspective of an ancient Greek, say, a mainlander from 1000 BCE, Knossos would have been jaw-droppingly strange. The bull was everywhere, worshipped, leaping across frescoes as young men and women vaulted over its horns in ritual displays. Stylized bull horns, horns of consecration, bristled from rooftops and altars. Add a palace that feels like a maze, and you have a perfect recipe for myth. Power, confusion, and something a little bit monstrous. But what if the monster was never meant to be taken literally? Some scholars think the whole thing is a metaphor, a fossilized memory of Cretan dominance over Athens, a time when tribute wasn't just a word but a humiliating annual delivery. The labyrinth becomes a symbol for political entrapment, for the inescapable grip of a foreign power. The Minotaur, that's the raw, terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Something you can't reason with and can't escape. Others go deeper, mining the myth for psychological gold, the labyrinth as the mind's dark underbelly. The Minotaur is the urge you can't name. Theseus, armed with nothing but a thread, descending into the shadowy corridors of the self. It's therapy, ancient style, except as usual, you don't get a happy ending, a therapist, or even a bill covered by your insurance. Still, the myth and the palace remain tangled together, each shadow feeding the other. Knossos is the closest thing you'll ever find to a real labyrinth, no matter how many times you check the blueprints or peer down into the ruins. No monster, no Ariadne waiting with a ball of string, but maybe, just maybe, something even stranger, a history that demanded to become a myth. And as you wander these dusty corridors, you're left with a question that haunts every crumbling wall. Did the legend grow from these stones, or did the stones shape the legend? In the end, Knossos is less about answers and more about questions that echo down the centuries. Up next, let's pull back the curtain on the civilization that built this enigma. Long before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears, there was the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. Long before Athens ever etched a column, or Sparta ever spat on a shield, you were Minoan, a member of a civilization that thrived on the island of Crete, while the rest of Europe was still figuring out how not to freeze to death in a hut. Forget hoplites and marble statues. Your world was painted in frescoes, scented with saffron, and ruled by a logic as fluid and winding as the palace you built. There were no ironclad armies, no glory-hunting generals. You, Minoan, were a master of the long game, trade, artistry, and architecture that whispered power rather than shouting it. At the pulsating heart of your world stood Knossos, a palace so sprawling and intricate it made later Greek temples look like garden sheds. But don't flatter yourself. This wasn't a mere royal residence. Knossos was the nucleus of your entire existence. It was government, marketplace, temple, and the ultimate status symbol rolled into one colossal labyrinth. Between 2600 and 1400 BCE, you turned Crete into the Mediterranean's nervous system, sending ships to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, hell, even Spain's distant sunburned shores. Your vessels glided across the sea, silent and swift, bearing not soldiers but pottery, bronze, saffron, and whatever else could be bartered for gold or prestige, while your contemporaries across the waters were busy walling themselves in and inventing new ways to stab each other. You were busy inventing civilization. Your art? Not endless scenes of men skewering each other for gods and glory. No, the walls of your palaces flourished with dolphins, lilies, bull leapers and women in flowing skirts, celebrations of nature, movement and life rather than death. Even your divine figures broke the mold. Your goddesses stood bare-breasted and defiant, snakes coiled around their arms, radiating a power that would make Zeus blush. They were symbols of fertility, transformation, or maybe just a warning not to underestimate a woman with a serpent. And then there was Knossos itself, not perched atop some forbidding crag, but nestled in a fertile valley. Its confidence measured not in fortifications but in audacity. No massive defensive walls. Either you felt supremely secure on your island, or you projected so much power that nobody dared knock on your door uninvited. Your armor was your reputation, and your architecture. You constructed multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and plumbing the likes of which wouldn't be seen again until Rome started getting ideas. The palace was a veritable warren, corridors twisting, rooms branching off into other rooms, stairways spiraling into shadow, or exploding into sudden bursts of sunlight. Light wells pierced the heart of the building, casting shafts of brilliance down into the labyrinth below. Even today, wanderers in Knossos emerge blinking and confused, as if spat out by the building itself. Straight lines? Good luck. Getting lost was practically a requirement. And here's the punchline. For all your sophistication, for all your frescoes and flush toilets, you left behind not a single deciphered sentence. Your script, Linear A, remains maddeningly undeciphered. All those records, prayers, shopping lists? To us, they're nothing but enigmatic scratches. We don't know what you called yourselves. We don't know the names of your kings, the words of your hymns, or the secrets whispered in Knossos' shadows. Your entire story is told in the language of ruins and pigment, interpreted, inevitably, by people who never knew your world. So what did you leave us? Ruins, art, and echoes, absorbed by the Mycenaeans, filtered through Greek myth, and finally recycled into the legend of the labyrinth. You were more than builders of palaces, you were architects of enigma. Knossos was never just a building, it was the living, throbbing heart of a civilization that glimmered for a brief moment, then vanished like a trick of the Aegean light. And yet, even now, some say its echo still wanders the maze. Imagine yourself in Knossos, walking through time itself. The first thing that hits you isn't just the scale, it's the design, the bone-deep sense of confusion. Rooms open into more rooms. Corridors fork and vanish. Staircases snake between levels, sometimes plunging into gloom, sometimes bursting into courtyards flooded with sunlight. Nothing is direct. Nothing is obvious. The whole place feels less like a palace and more like a living beast, shifting its entrails to confuse and impress. It's not hard to see why strangers whispered of labyrinths, of monsters lurking at the center. But the only minotaur here is the palace itself, a structure so complex it devours logic. Knossos sprawled across an estimated 150,000 square feet, boasting over 1,000 chambers, some cramped, some cavernous, none accidental. This wasn't a random sprawl of rooms. These were purpose-built workshops, grain stores, shrines, apartments, and ceremonial spaces, all radiating around a central courtyard. It's easy to picture that courtyard packed with spectators, watching bull leapers vault over snorting beasts, or priests conducting rituals as sunlight poured down from above. The palace rose in tiers, sometimes 4, even 5 stories high, layered along the natural slopes, using the landscape as both foundation and camouflage. Navigating it, forget it. You'd need memory, luck, or maybe a ball of thread, something a certain legendary hero would later make famous. But beneath the apparent chaos was genius. You, Minoan, had mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms with tall air shafts and open stairwells. Rainwater flowed through clay pipes, and toilets flushed away the evidence of last night's feast. Long before Rome ever considered such luxuries, you were living in the Bronze Age, but your plumbing was pure science fiction. One chamber stands out above the rest, at least to those who came after the so-called throne room. Here, an alabaster seat is built into the wall, flanked by benches, presided over by frescoed griffins, mythical beasts painted to guard the mystery. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess, or a council of elders? The answer remains as elusive as linear A. The room whispers questions, not answers. And the walls, oh the walls, they speak in colour and movement. Dolphins leap over bathtubs. Women in flounced skirts parade with bare chests, their eyes challenging you to look away. Youths are immortalized mid-vault, hands clutching the horns of a bull, bodies suspended between danger and grace. This isn't mere decoration. This is an identity, a worldview inseparable from earth and sea, where art is a record of what matters. But the deeper you wander, the more Knossos seems to blur the line between reality and myth. Corridors loop back on themselves, rooms seem to multiply. It's easy to imagine some parts were designed to disorient, maybe even to inspire awe or a touch of fear. Maybe that's the true origin of the labyrinth legend, not a prison for monsters, but a palace so alive and unpredictable it felt sentient. No need for locked doors or mythical beasts. The real challenge was finding your way through the mind of the architect who built this place. Knossos wasn't just administrative headquarters or aristocratic crash pad. It was a place of worship, an architectural manifestation of the Minoan soul, shot through with ritual, myth, and divine uncertainty. Unlike the Greeks who followed, with their grand temples to Zeus or Athena, your sacred spaces were woven directly into the palace's bones. Shrines lurked in corners, pillars rose like silent sentinels, and stylized horns emblems of the bull crowned roofs and altars. Everywhere you turned, the bull motif dominated, a constant reminder of the animal's spiritual weight. But you didn't fear the bull. You celebrated it. The iconic bull-leaping fresco isn't just a snapshot of athletic prowess. It's a frozen moment in a sacred drama. Young men and women hurtled over the backs of charging bulls, risking life and limb in a ritual that was part sport, part offering, part cosmic ballet. These weren't games for entertainment. They were acts of worship, symbolic victories over chaos, or perhaps desperate negotiations with powers beyond control. Below the palace, in storerooms thick with dust, archaeologists would one day unearth your snake goddesses, potent figurines, bare to the waist, arms raised high, serpents winding around their bodies. These weren't meek idols. They radiated ferocity and protection, guardians of household, fertility, and perhaps all life itself. To you, snakes weren't evil. They were emblems of renewal, creatures that slipped between worlds, marking the boundary between earth and underworld. The rooms where these goddesses were found hint at household shrines, sacred hideaways tucked amid the bustle of palace life, where quiet rituals met the everyday. Taken together, the frescoes, the horns, the altars, the maze-like design, the palace starts to feel like one vast humming ritual machine. It wasn't just a place to live or govern, it was a structure built to bridge the human and the divine, to erase the boundary between sacred and secular. No need for a monumental temple at the city's edge. The whole palace was a temple, every threshold a potential passage to the gods, every echo a possible prayer. Knossos didn't merely house people, it housed gods. For centuries, it stood as a beacon, a lighthouse of prosperity, invention, and a startling sophistication that made later civilizations look like enthusiastic amateurs. And then, as if someone whispered the wrong word in a ritual, everything changed. Suddenly, Knossos was abandoned. The paint faded, the dancers stopped leaping, the pipes dried up. The Minoan civilization, which had ruled the sea and dazzled its neighbors, simply dissolved into history's blind spot. What happened? The theories are as tangled as the palace's corridors. Some blame nature. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted with a violence that reshaped the world. tsunamis battered Crete's northern coast. Ash blotted out the sun. Crops withered and chaos seeped in. Knossos wasn't obliterated outright, but the aftershocks, economic, political, spiritual, echoed for generations. Others point to war. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have seized their opportunity. The archaeological record hints at a brief Mycenaean occupation, a shift in art and script from Linear A to Linear B, from bull leapers to warriors. The language changed, and so did the soul of the palace. But here's the kicker. There's almost no evidence of violence in Knossos' fall. No charred bones, no massacre. The palace didn't go out in a blaze of glory, but in a hush. The rooms simply emptied. The rituals stopped. Nature crept back, moss and silence filling the void where prayers once echoed. When Homer sang of Crete, Knossos was already myth, its true story lost to time, its memory preserved only in legends of labyrinths and monsters. And maybe that's the final Minoan joke on you, the would-be historian. What killed Knossos wasn't just fire or invasion. It was the quiet, relentless weight of time. The way all beauty eventually sinks beneath new empires and new myths. The bones remain, and if you press your ear to the ground, you might still hear the distant hum of the maze calling you back. For now, you Minoan are gone. But the palace, its enigma, its design, its whispered secrets still lingers beneath the Cretan soil, waiting for someone to dig deeper. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Because for thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan earth, its mysteries preserved in darkness, waiting for rediscovery. Let's see what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. For 3 millennia, Knossos slept, not in some glorious golden slumber, mind you. Just buried, suffocated beneath layers of Cretan dirt, olive roots, and the indifferent tick of centuries. You were rubble, a shapeless rise on the landscape, mistaken for little more than a farmer's headache or a shepherd's shortcut. Your name? Forgotten. Your stories? Distorted beyond recognition, worn down by rumour and wishful thinking, until even the Minotaur would have failed to recognize himself in the retellings. For the world you were nothing but a mound, until, inevitably, someone decided to dig. Enter Sir Arthur Evans, British, bearded, and bursting with the sort of imperial confidence you only get after inheriting a fortune and reading too much Homer by candlelight. Evans didn't stumble upon you, Knossos. He hunted you with a fervour reserved for men who believe they can outwit both gods and time. 1900, the dawn of a new century. Evans purchases the land atop your buried bones, waving about coins and contracts. Local farmers, tired of unearthing odd little seals and bits of pottery while trying to grow their olives, must have thought him half mad. But Evans, he smelled legend. He begins to dig, not with the delicate tweezery patience of a modern archaeologist, but with the gusto of a man seeking destiny. And what does he find? Not just a palace, but a sprawling, bewildering labyrinth of halls, staircases, and rooms so confusing that even Daedalus might have needed a map. Evans, standing in your dust-choked corridors, proclaims, "This, surely, is the home of King Minos, the labyrinth of legend, the birthplace of the Minotaur myth." The echoes of Homer and Hesiod ringing in his ears louder than the pickaxes. Evans wasn't content with mere discovery. Oh no, he had to reimagine you. Knossos. If history is a stage, Evans was both director and set designer, sometimes blurring the line between evidence and inspiration. He dubbed your ancient builders the Minoans, after Minos, a king who may or may not have existed outside the fevered Greek imagination. He studied your frescoes and symbols, reconstructed your fallen walls, and lest anyone mistake him for a purist, poured reinforced concrete over your ruins, wherever his theories outpaced his trowel. Some called this vision, others called it vandalism. But there you stand today, part Bronze Age marvel, part Edwardian daydream, a relic with a dash of retro-modern flair, courtesy of one man's restless ambition. Still, give Evans credit. Where others saw just a heap of dusty stones, he saw a civilization that predated classical Greece by 1,000 years. He gave Europe its first clear look at a people who built not with war in mind, but with an eye for beauty, ritual, and seafaring grace, he unearthed Linear A, your stubbornly undeciphered script, a script that still refuses to yield up its secrets, as if mocking every linguist who's dared to try. You, Knossos, became not just an archaeological site, but a riddle wrapped in frescoes, sealed with lost language, and served with a side of controversy. But Evans did more than just dig up stones. He exhumed a myth. He forced historians, armchair and professional alike, to confront the grim fact that behind every legend, no matter how fantastical, lurks a sliver of truth, twisted by time and retelling. Your palace is real. Your labyrinth is, at least, architectural. The Minotaur, less so, unless you count bull-shaped cult paraphernalia as evidence of bovine-human hybrids. Still, you are the source, the root from which the myth grew wild and tangled. Knossos had lain dormant for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that shattered your sleep, and the world hasn't stopped listening for echoes since. But let's not get too sentimental. Step into Knossos today, and you're not just walking through crumbled halls, you're tiptoeing through a minefield of symbols. Frescoes cling to your walls, dolphins leaping, lilies blooming, birds swirling through painted sky. Carvings and patterns snake across plaster and stone, each one a cryptic glyph in a language you never bothered to translate for posterity. You, Minoan, left us no Rosetta Stone. Thanks for that. Linear A, your primary script, is still as indecipherable as a toddler's scribble. So instead, we're left to squint at your art, trying to decode meaning from a mural or a pottery shard. What were you trying to say exactly? Because you're not obsessed with war, unlike your later Greek neighbors. There are no endless parades of spearmen or kings lording over defeated foes. Instead, you gave us nature, dolphins cavorting, lilies nodding, acrobats vaulting over massive bulls. Even your dangerous rituals pulse with movement, color, and a kind of strange, joyful order. You didn't catalogue conquests. You celebrated cycles, life, death, renewal, maybe even cosmic harmony, if the scholars are to be believed. Your most iconic motif is the double axe. The labyrinths, etched into shrines, painted on walls, carved into stone. A symbol of what? Power? Divinity? Female deities? Lunar cycles? All of the above, or none. No one can say for sure. Some even argue the word labyrinth comes from labyrinth, not meaning maze, but house of the double axe. Suddenly the labyrinth is less prison, more sanctum. Good luck telling that to Theseus. Then there are the horns of consecration. Stylized bull's horns crowning your walls and altars. Religious markers, territorial boundaries. A subtle way of saying, don't touch the sacred stuff. Maybe, bulls in every form dominate your symbolism. Painted, sculpted, ritualized, bulls everywhere. As if you wanted to ensure no visitor ever forgot your favorite animal. Did the bull stand for nature, fertility, chaos, or divine presence? Pick a theory. There's one for every season, and not a single one is definitive. Even your architecture seems to hum with hidden meaning. Some archaeologists whisper that Knossos wasn't designed for function alone. Its winding corridors, nested rooms, and sudden dead ends might mirror celestial cycles or seasonal changes. A symbolic journey through life and death, or perhaps a spiritual maze meant to confuse not the body, but the soul. But again, with Linear A stubbornly silent, every theory is a high-wire act above a pit of speculation. You, Minoan, spoke in symbols, not in stories. We're left to interpret, to squabble, to guess. So what are you really saying, Knossos? We see your patterns, hear rhythms in your painted processions, but the meaning, it hovers just out of reach, like a thread dangling in the dark, always just a little too short to grasp. You are a ruin. Yes, but not a dead one. Walk your corridors and there's a pulse beneath the shattered tile. Not the footsteps of ghosts or the whisper of gods, but the vibration of myth, of lost lives, of mysteries that refuse to die quietly. Thousands of years have passed since your walls fell, yet you cling to us, winding us deeper into your maze. Tourists shuffle through your sun-baked courts, snapping selfies and squinting at faded paint. Archaeologists with sunburns and bad knees still dig for answers, armed with trowels and endless optimism. Writers naturally can't resist spinning new tales from your shadows. The Minotaur may be a fairy tale, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real enough. You sense it in the confusion of your corridors, the repetition of your symbols, the way the sun slants through a doorway just so, making the past shimmer for a moment. And what do we really know about you? Not much. Your rulers, anonymous, your priests and priestesses, nameless. The prayers whispered in your sanctuaries, the laws that governed your people, all vanished. No epic poems, no statues of kings, no endless lists of battles won. Just this, you loved beauty. You worshipped nature. You understood balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. You were first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome's marble excess, before the Hebrews or Persians built their temples, there was Knossos, palace, city, temple, and perhaps a living story. This perhaps is your true legacy. Not a maze to trap heroes, but a narrative etched in stone and pigment. A myth that refuses to die, constantly morphing in the minds of those who wander your ruins. The Greeks made you a legend. We made you a science. But you are, and always have been, both at once a riddle with no answer, an invitation to marvel and despair in equal measure. Today, we can stroll your ruins in blazing daylight. We can map your rooms, reconstruct your frescoes, and argue endlessly about your meanings. Yet the mystery lingers. The line between fact and legend flickers, shimmering like the mirage over your sun-baked stones. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you endure. Knossos, you don't surrender all your secrets. You remind us, with every faded mural and every undeciphered script, that not all history is meant to be solved. Some is simply meant to be felt. So here you stand, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, a place that is less an answer than a question. A labyrinth with no center, only endless passageways leading further in, always deeper. And like Theseus, we're all still chasing the thread, hoping for meaning, finding only more mystery. But don't get too comfortable in your ancient reverie. The age of myth and labyrinths gives way brutally to the age of siege engines, where art yields to engineering, and the poetry of walls is replaced by the brutal arithmetic of destruction. Because, as you're about to see, ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. Let's not kid ourselves. Ancient engineers weren't just clever, they were sadists with a knack for applied physics. Picture yourself as one of these early siege aficionados, hefting a tree trunk with your bare hands, surrounded by a dozen equally unfortunate comrades. The first battering rams were nothing more than logs, swung with the subtlety of drunken lumberjacks at the walls of some doomed city. There's no artistry here, just brute force, splinters, and a strong chance of a herniated disc. But of course that wasn't enough. Humans, ever the overachievers when it comes to breaking things, soon realized that rams deserved an upgrade. Enter the wheeled frame, a rolling coffin with a roof, its sole purpose to shelter you from the boiling oil, arrows, and whatever else the defenders could hurl down in their panic. Congratulations, you've just graduated from target practice to moving target practice. If you thought the ram was just a tool, think again. The Assyrians, those cheerful connoisseurs of mass destruction, weaponized the ram's very presence. Their engineers bolted on archer platforms, transforming the ram into a multi-tool of terror. Picture their siege towers, rams pounding away at city gates while archers rain arrows from above. Every blow against the stone sounded like divine judgment. The reliefs from Nineveh don't lie. Iron-tipped rams roll forward, inexorable and pitiless, turning the gates of rebellious cities into kindling. And if you're inside those walls, you know exactly what's coming. Surrender, or watch your defenses disintegrate like a stale biscuit dunked too long in your morning tea. Of course, it was never just about bashing the front door. Rams were versatile, smashing weak points, collapsing towers, and battering down gates with equal enthusiasm. The mere sight of one at your gates was a promise of misery. The Greeks, never content to leave well enough alone, streamlined the design. The Romans, those tireless perfectionists of destruction, took it to the next level. Meet the Ares, the Roman battering ram. Immense and suspended from chains within a mobile shed. Some were so massive they required entire teams to operate, their collective effort producing a drumbeat of doom that echoed through the stones. Imagine, you, shoulder to shoulder with your fellow legionaries, sweating beneath a wooden roof, swinging a beam that sounds like thunder incarnate. No, you don't get hazard pay. But before you start feeling too powerful, remember, rams demanded coordination. Every operator had to move in perfect rhythm, swinging the beam while dodging flaming arrows, rocks, and on a bad day the contents of a chamber pot. If you stalled, you were finished. A motionless ram was a sitting duck. But when the ram got going, really going, it was unstoppable. This was physics with a grudge, flesh and wood against stone and mortar, ancient warfare distilled to its brutal, unvarnished core. And this, my friend, was only the overture. If the battering ram was the Neanderthal, the catapult was the Machiavelli of siegecraft. While the ram got up close and personal, the catapult preferred to keep its distance, lobbing misery from afar. These weren't just tools of destruction. They were weapons of psychological warfare, the world's first true artillery. Their arrival on the battlefield rewrote the rules, turning walls from sanctuaries into targets. The earliest catapults materialized in the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, spawned by the feverish imaginations of those who wanted to add a little more drama to the business of killing. Dionysius the Elder of Syracuse, never a man to shy away from innovation if it meant more blood, ordered up the first torsion-powered catapults, using twisted sinew and hair as impromptu springs. These were not your garden variety slingshots for the oversized toddler. These were precision instruments, engineered for maximum havoc. Here's where things get mechanical. Imagine you're a Greek siege engineer, twisting together ropes made from animal sinew, so tightly they hum under the strain. Release the tension, and the stored energy launches stones, javelins, or flaming projectiles hundreds of meters. The main variants? The ballista, a monstrous crossbow launching bolts the size of fence posts, and the stone-throwing catapult, which could lob boulders over walls or straight into the enemy's living room. The Romans, ever the magpies of military innovation, took these designs and ran with them. Their catapults could be broken down, carted around, and reassembled wherever the empire's appetite for conquest demanded. Some could hurl 60-pound stones with enough force to shatter gates, ramparts, and, occasionally, the hopes of any unfortunate soul in their path. But don't be fooled. Catapults weren't just about brute force. They were about messaging, literally and figuratively. Generals used them to lob not only rocks, but also corpses. Yes, corpses over enemy walls, sowing both disease and dread. Severed heads were a common projectile, their gruesome arc over the battlements as much a statement as a tactic. In one particularly inspired episode, pestilence-ridden bodies were fired into a besieged city, unleashing the world's earliest known biological assault. Not exactly the stuff Hollywood wants you to remember. But as impressive as they were, catapults had their limitations. Too heavy, too complex, and all too often at the mercy of the terrain. Still, when placed correctly, they could batter a city into submission from a disturbingly safe distance. Now, for the first time, walls weren't just battered, they were besieged from the air. The sky itself had turned hostile. And just when you thought the arms race of misery couldn't escalate, along comes the trebuchet, the undisputed monarch of medieval siege engines. If the ram was the brute and the catapult the tactician, the trebuchet was the king, striding onto the battlefield with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball in a cathedral. Its size alone was enough to make defenders reconsider their career choices. The principle was deceptively simple. A massive swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame, counterbalanced by a ponderous weight. Raise the weight, let it drop, and physics does the rest. The arm whips forward, flinging a sling-loaded projectile in a majestic arc over the ramparts. It's elegant, it's terrifying, and it's a masterclass in controlled devastation. Origin stories for the trebuchet are as convoluted as any royal genealogy. The earliest versions, the traction trebuchets, likely appeared in China around the 4th century BCE. relying on teams of men for power. But it was the counterweight trebuchet that would make European and Islamic engineers weep with joy, and their victims weep with fear. Emerging in the 12th century, probably via Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries, it spread across castles and crusades with the infectious enthusiasm of a plague. The results were staggering. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300-pound stones over 300 meters, smashing towers, pulverizing walls, and cratering enemy morale like a divine mallet. And it wasn't just the reach. The arc of the projectile meant that even the inner sanctums of a fortress were no longer safe. Courtyards, barracks, supply depots, nothing was off limits. But what really set the trebuchet apart was its versatility. Stones were only the beginning. Diseased carcasses, barrels of burning pitch, pots of quicklime to blind defenders, even taunting messages or insults. If you could fit it in the sling, you could make your point. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. One notorious episode at the siege of Stirling Castle saw the construction of Warwolf, a trebuchet so colossal that the defenders surrendered before a single shot had been fired. The king, in a move that would make even the most sadistic boss proud, refused their surrender just to see Warwolf in action. Because why accept capitulation when you can have a demonstration? Despite the drama, the trebuchet was not without its flaws. Assembly took hours, firing was slow, and only the most patient and skilled engineers need apply. But when that counterweight finally dropped, the world watched and waited. No other engine combined range, force, and sheer psychological torment so completely. The trebuchet was less a weapon and more an apocalypse delivered in slow motion. If you were on the receiving end, you had time to contemplate your life choices before the stone hit home. So, next time you daydream about the glory of siege warfare, remember, it wasn't just about walls and gates. It was a spectacle of terror, a contest of engineering, and a relentless parade of misery for everyone involved. And as these machines evolved, so too did the art of defense and counterattack. Because while rams battered down doors and trebuchets made the very sky rain death, some engineers asked a dangerous question. What if you took the fight above, below, and all around? That's where siege towers, tunneling, and twisted defensive tactics enter the stage, proving that in war, no innovation goes unanswered. Let's set the scene. You're standing on the windswept ramparts of your city, squinting into the haze of dust and fear, and then you hear it, a deep groaning rumble. You pray it's just your imagination. But no, over the horizon lumbers a monstrosity. A siege tower. Picture a wooden skyscraper on wheels, draped in glistening, steaming animal hides. Because the last thing you want is for a flaming arrow to turn your war machine into a rolling bonfire. On every level, archers, spearmen, and the most optimistic foot soldiers strain for a glimpse of the future. Yours, preferably conquered. Congratulations, you're about to experience the ancient world's answer to the tank, bus, and haunted house combined. Siege towers weren't for the faint-hearted or the subtle. The Assyrians, always eager to one-up the neighbors in creative destruction, rolled out some of the earliest versions in the 9th century BCE. But it was the Greeks and their ever-dramatic Hellenistic successors who turned the siege tower into a mobile stage for nightmares. Entered Demetrius, the Macedonian general. So extra, he built the Helepolis, the taker of cities, in 305 BCE. 9 stories tall, armored in iron, bristling with catapults, and so heavy it threatened to sink itself before it could sink your city. If you're keeping score, the tower ultimately collapsed under its own impossible ambition. But you have to admire the sheer gall. Why the obsession with verticality? Simple. A wall only works if you can't get over it. A siege tower doesn't just bring attackers to your door, it delivers them straight onto your parapet, like some nightmarish Amazon Prime package. Archers on the upper decks rain death down in a withering storm, while the lower levels disgorge grim, mud-caked warriors through a gangplank onto your city's supposedly safe walkways. The instant that bridge drops, the abstract threat of siege becomes a very literal brawl for survival. Face to face, sword to shield, dignity optional. But don't let the grandeur fool you. Siege towers were as vulnerable as they were imposing. They trundled forward at the speed of regret, bogged down by mud and sabotage. Defenders, who'd rather not be trampled or roasted, responded with ingenuity and spite. Moats? Flood them. Ditches? Dig them deep. Counterscarps, secondary walls within walls, meant that even if a tower made it past the first obstacle, it would find itself stuck, awkward, and exposed to everything from flaming arrows to boulders dropped with malicious enthusiasm. Some towers ended their days listing sideways, stuck in mud and ridicule. Still, when they worked, the effect was catastrophic. The battlefield flipped from flat to vertical. A race to control the high ground. Suddenly, you as a defender are no longer looking down on the enemy. You're wrestling them at eye level, or worse, above you. The siege tower made height both your greatest asset and your most immediate peril. Once enemy troops swarmed your ramparts, chaos reigned. The wall you trusted became the alleyway of your undoing. Of course, not every siege engine made a grand entrance. While the towers and rams roared, some of the most effective destruction happened out of sight, in the silent, claustrophobic dark. Welcome to the world of siege tunneling, or sapping, the fine art of making the earth betray you. If you thought the sword was a dirty business, try undermining a wall with nothing but shovels, wooden props, and a casual disregard for your own lungs. Here's how it worked. You dig beneath the enemy wall, shore up the tunnel with timbers, and then, in the ultimate display of medieval passive aggression, set the supports alight. The burning wood collapses. So does your tunnel. And if all goes to plan, the wall above follows suit. One moment, your city feels invincible. The next, a 50-foot stretch of rampart crumbles like stale cake. There are no parades for sappers, no epic poems, just darkness, sweat, and the creeping suspicion that the next sound you hear might be the defenders' counter-tunnelers coming for you. The Assyrians got the ball rolling, but the Greeks, Persians, and later the ever-resourceful medieval armies perfected the craft. At the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans tried digging under the walls, only to discover that the defenders were digging right back. Countermining, they called it, a subterranean duel, fought by touch, sound, and whatever sharp object you could swing in a crawl space. Imagine hundreds of feet below the earth, armed only with a torch, a knife, and the knowledge that your enemy might burst through the wall of dirt at any moment. If that sounds romantic, you haven't considered the suffocation, the panic, or the very real chance that you'll be buried alive. This wasn't heroism, it was terror, with a side of dirt. When sapping worked, the results shocked everyone. Take the siege of Rochester Castle in 1212. King John's engineers tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat. Yes, pig fat, because nothing says medieval engineering like a barbecue gone wrong, and set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, and so did the tower above. The defenders, stunned and out of options, surrendered. By the 13th century, siege engineers had become a blend of geologist, demolition expert, and mad scientist, analyzing soil, foundations, and stress points with frightening precision. They proved an uncomfortable truth. If you can't go over a wall, and you can't go through it, you might as well erase it from below. But let's not give attackers all the credit. Defenders, desperate and imaginative, had their own arsenal of horrors ready. The most infamous was Greek fire, a Byzantine invention from the 7th century CE that makes napalm look like scented candle wax. No one knows the exact recipe, but the results were obvious. A burning, sticky nightmare that clung to ships, walls, and soldiers, and continued burning even on water, sprayed from siphons or lobbed in clay pots. It turned sieges into scenes of hellish chaos. Ships became flaming skeletons. Walls, once safe, became ovens. The formula was so secretive that it died with the empire. But the terror it inspired outlasted Byzantium itself. And if you didn't have Greek fire on tap, don't worry. Boiling liquids were always in fashion. Boiling water, oil, or even sand poured from murder holes, those charming architectural features designed for maximum suffering, cascaded onto the heads of anyone foolish enough to approach. Boiling oil was especially feared. It clung to flesh and cloth, spreading agony and fire, while hot sand slithered into every seam of armor. burning sensitive skin in places no bard would dare sing about. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. You climb a ladder, you get a face full of pain. Gravity, too, became a weapon in the defender's hands. Stones, logs, even the occasional dead animal, anything heavy enough really, were dropped from above, not just to maim, but to shatter siege engines and morale in equal measure. And if that wasn't enough, defenders littered their fortresses with traps, pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades, and the kind of surprises that would make even the most determined attacker second-guess their career choices. Castles became puzzles designed not for comfort, but for confusion and punishment. Every trick bought the defenders time. Time for disease to sweep through the attacker's camp. Time for supply lines to wither. Time for reinforcements to arrive, or for hope to die on both sides. And here's the secret most history books won't tell you. In siege warfare, destruction is only half the goal. The other half is psychological. Siege engines weren't just weapons. They were props in a theatre of doom. Their very presence was a message. You are not safe. The Assyrians, ever the showmen, dragged their machines across the sands in full view of their targets. A slow-motion parade of dread, the Romans built their camps conspicuously close, letting every hammer blow and test launch echo inside the defenders' heads. Siege was as much about spectacle as it was about physics. Fear was the most reliable weapon of all. Sometimes the message was literal. Severed heads, messengers, generals, unlucky passers-by were catapulted over the walls, a personalized note written in flesh. During the sieges of Constantinople, the payloads included not just rocks but bodies, sometimes diseased, always demoralizing. In 1346 at Kaffa, the Mongols allegedly flung plague-infected corpses into the city, unwittingly sending the Black Death on its infamous tour of Europe. The trebuchet, that magnificent lever of doom, was not just an engineering marvel. It was a psychological sledgehammer. You could hear it before you saw it. The groan of winches, the snap of ropes, the ponderous thud of the counterweight. Each launch was a heartbeat of inevitability, an audible countdown to disaster. But perhaps nothing was as terrifying as silence. The pause before the next volley, the hush as engineers adjusted their aim, the moments when the only thing defenders could hear was their own fear. Even the sounds were weapons. The rhythmic pounding of a battering ram, the sudden stillness before a boulder landed, these were calculated to drive the besieged to despair. Ancient commanders knew, break the spirit, and the walls would open themselves. For all the mythic glory, siege warfare was a slog, a slow-motion collapse of bodies and minds. Sometimes, the mind gave out before the masonry. Commanders aimed not just to crush stones, but to sow hopelessness. If you could convince the defenders that resistance was futile, if you could make them believe that their gods had fled and their walls were illusions, the fight was over before the breach was made. And then comes gunpowder, thundering its way onto the scene in the late Middle Ages. The old engines, catapults, towers, trebuchets fade into obsolescence. But don't let the smoke and noise fool you. The soul of siege warfare didn't disappear, it evolved. Cannons, with a single deafening shot, could do what all the sappers in Europe only dreamed of, reduce walls to rubble in moments. By the 15th century, Europe's proud castles were falling not to cunning or patience, but to iron balls and black powder. The rules had changed, but the game remained the same. Yet the ghosts of ancient siege engineers still haunt the blueprints of modern war. Every artillery barrage, every missile strike, every lesson in trajectory and force owes a debt to those first rickety towers and silent tunnels. Modern military doctrine, shock and awe, overwhelming displays of force, psychological warfare, it's all just a digital remix of the same ancient tune. The sight of a siege tower rolling forward, banners streaming, was the original version of shock and awe. It was never just about breaking a wall. It was always about breaking you. The legacy of siege warfare is written across the scars of history. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still bake under the desert sun. At Constantinople, whose triple walls stood for 1,000 years against the best machines the world could throw at them, until gunpowder finally won the argument. In ruined castles from England to the Levant, The rounded towers and angled bastions are silent reminders of a world that never stopped reimagining how to survive the next assault. And don't think we've outgrown it. In a world of drones, satellites and cyber blockades, siege warfare is alive and well. It's just traded stone for code and battering rams for firewalls. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now digital. Blockades invisible. But the logic remains unchanged. Someone wants in, someone else wants them out. And both sides are as stubborn, ingenious and ruthless as ever. So, as you dust off the last ashes of your city and stare at the battered walls, real or virtual, remember, the machines may change, the tactics may evolve, but the spirit of siege warfare is eternal. There are no upgrades, no guaranteed glory, and definitely no dental plan for the defenders. The only certainty is this: in the endless contest of breaking and resisting, the siege, like history itself, never truly ends.